Daryl, that we're going to discuss a little bit today in our podcast is habits, and maybe the developing of habits, good and bad. But the first question I've posed to you here is, I've heard the term used previously, a creature of habit, and I'm wondering, how can we be a creature of good habits? Bad.
Well, that idea of a creature of habits is really is a simple idea that we get into our comfort zone. Okay, going back to that phrase earlier, and when we're in that space, we just automatically do things. It's like when I was running a workshop before lockdown, we were talking about habits, and you know, I was the company I was with. We talked about how we talked that morning about their journey to work. And I asked them specifically, I says, let's just consider your journey from work, from the time you left home to the time you got into the workplace. And we talked a little bit about that journey. And for many of them, as they drove into their workplace, it was almost as if it was that creature of habit. You know, they'd forgotten a lot of their journey because it's just the same thing they see day in, day out. What was
Autopilot,
amazing,
like that.
sorry?
Autopilot, really.
Autopilot, yeah, absolutely. It's just that autopilot that, and you've probably done it yourself, Chris. You start at point A, you arrive at point B, and in between's just like a haze. You just don't recall unless there's something very unusual happen. You've no kind of knowledge or understanding of what's happened in between the A and the B. What I found fascinating that morning as well, that when I I probed a little further and questioned them further, I says, "Tell me about where you park your car." And as it turned out, every single one of them parked their car in the same spot every day, if that spot wasn't already taken. But it generally wasn't, and they weren't assigned it. They just parked their car, and they would reverse in or park forward in. That was their habits. We fall into those daily habitual routines. We get onto autopilot, and it's a bit like, I guess, I don't. Do you play any musical instruments, Chris?
No, tried to learn to play the guitar, but still trying.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll go back to my driving one with you then. So when you were learning to drive your car, was it a little bit difficult to start off with?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Now, do you even think about driving the car?
No, it's just like you said, you're on autopilot. Absolutely.
You're just on autopilot. And unless something really happens, you just kind of stay on that autopilot. So we to become a creature of good habits, right? You've actually, first of all, got to somehow interrupt that flow. You've got to recognize when you're in that sort of autopilot stage, if that makes sense. Okay. If you want to develop really good habits, you've got to sort of switch off, get out of, recognize that you need to change. And there's usually some kind of trigger. Okay. I'll maybe come on to triggers, but that's if we're going to become a creature of good habits, we've got to stop and recognize and get off autopilot.
Right. So I think we're coming nicely into the next question
Yep.
then, and that's really struck a chord with me. So is there a process then? And if there is a process, what's the process of getting into a habit of doing something? Forming habits, for example.
Yeah. So there are loads of books, Chris. Now I spent as a leadership development trainer and coach and facilitator, really focused on personal development and leadership development. I mean, this is just a small part of my kind of library, but one of the key books that I've read on the topic. Now, I'm not on any sort of commissions or anything for this, but as this one here. So it's called The Power of Habit. Okay, by a guy by the name of Charles Duhigg. Okay, and some of your listeners might be interested in this. Others might, I've read all that kind of stuff before. But for me, that was a bit of a wow. It was actually a bit of an aha moment.
Right.
And he talks about three specific things. Okay, and I'm going to shorten his book into like about 1 minute here, but he talks about three specific things. He talks about triggers, routines, and rewards. Okay, triggers, routines, rewards. And there's a lot more in his book about craving something and a real craving, a real desire to change. Okay. So you need to have that fundamentally. You need to want to actually change and have that word craving suggests a real passion to want to find a new habit. So I'll give you a little example. And this is a stupid little example, right? But for me, it encapsulates how you can really develop some new habits. So for me, I in our living room, I can't remember if you've ever been in our living room, Chris, but in our living room we have this really big clock. It's a big clock. It's probably maybe not quite a meter, but it's a meter by so it's a big clock above our fireplace. And my favorite place to study in the morning is, because I'm an early riser and I love to study in the morning, my favorite place to study is our living room. But as I entered that living room some time ago now, I discovered something. Early in the morning, that clock, it's got a loud tick. So, it ticks loud. So I thought, oh, that's a right annoying that. So what did I do? I actually have earplugs now. Okay. Because that's my favorite comfy chair to study. So in the morning, I'd put my earplugs in. So the trigger, I'm putting into Charles Duhigg's language, the trigger was the clock. Okay. The routine became my earplugs. And the reward was quite simply, silence. That's just a silly little example of triggers, routines, rewards. And when you break it down into a craving for something, I love peace and quiet for my study. I have to be alone. I hate it when Monique or Kyle or Christy come in. No, rubbish. Can't do it. TV off, radio off, silence. And for me, it's in those kind of moments of the stillness that I can develop some new habits. Now, for you, for others that are listening to this, you'll find that there's usually some kind of trigger that happens, and identifying that trigger is kind of key. There will then be some kind of routine that you might have to change, chop, challenge, okay? And then will come the reward, whatever it might well be. And that's the process of getting into doing something, a habit of doing something. Does that make any sense? Have I explained that okay?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Yeah. And that goes on, I think, really well. And I'm going to do the same thing as I did previously, and maybe ask this question or these two questions together. How can we jolt ourselves out of bad habits? And you've talked about that a little bit already, and change for good, maybe not just a short-term thing. And how do we get that consistency then of that's needed to maybe change for good? Any thoughts on that at all?
Well, I think for the bad habits, you've simply it may take the help of a friend or a coach or someone. The number of times that I've come up with, there's usually a sort of some sort of big picture I would call it like a macro goal. Okay, a big thing. So if someone wants to quit smoking, for instance, that might not be a topical one on this session, but for someone quitting smoking, that's a big thing. But to get to that macro goal, you've got to have micro goals. You've got to have small steps to get you on that way. And there has to be a reason, a craving, a why. Why does this matter to me? Okay. Why that you have to have a personal why. And so recognizing it, having a real craving, a real desire to change. There has to be a why to improve my health, to improve my mental well-being, to improve my spirituality, to whatever it is. There is a big pictures thing, and then you've got to take those tiny little steps to kind of consistently do it daily. And once you start to do those daily steps, it just becomes a habit. Study shows London. It was the can't remember. It was the it's one of the London universities. It's one of the London universities did a big bit of research on how long it actually takes. How many days do you have to do something before it becomes a habit? Okay. And the research that they showed, it was something like 84 days that we've got to do something consistently before it becomes a habit. Okay. Now, for instance, now I'm about 140 or I can't remember 141. I think I said earlier about my Duolingo. Right, my commitment was my big picture thing was I want to improve my Dutch. Okay, so that's my macro goal. My micro goal is that every day I need to study Dutch for at least half an hour. And now I'm at day 141. It's no longer an issue. I just do it. Okay, it's become part of my daily routine. Why does it matter? Because when I get to Holland in a few weeks' time, I don't want to look like a right prat. I want to be able to actually converse with them and actually hold some dialogue with them. Okay, so that's my personal why. And when it comes to habits, then you've got to have a real craving and desire. If you've just got a passing interest, if you've just got a kind of flimsy kind of, yeah, I'd like to do that, and no willing to do anything about it, you'll never do it. You've got to have a real kind of craving, a real desire to go and do it. And then once you get into that routine, you get past that sort of 70, 80 odd days, it just kind of starts to happen for you. I don't even think at all, period, about writing this every day. I've been doing it all of my life, and I'll do it till the day I drop dead and start pushing up the daisies, because it's me.
Mm-hmm.
There you go. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. Thank you. And a couple of things there when you were talking about the micro and macro of habits, it's probably very similar because it's like a goal, isn't it?
Yeah.
Maybe writing down those little micro habits that you're going to do to achieve the big picture. And I suppose from a self-reliance perspective, then, how does developing habits, this, I suppose, is you've used it, this determination and kind of craving to change or to develop good habits. How can that help us become more self-reliant then, Daryl?
Oh, that was one of the tougher questions as well, Chris, if I'm being honest. That and the first one were probably the toughest two questions that you'd set me.
Mm-hmm.
It actually becomes a bit of a for those of you who are listening today, for your listeners, it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, to be frank, because ultimately, the direction that we've received as members of the church is to become self-reliant in all things. And there's a bit of a natural progression as you go through some of these self-reliance materials. And I think that it's actually, you've just got to really begin with something. So if it's for instance, let's take one of the self-reliance principles of maybe on budgeting. Okay, I was like, that's on your financial kind of status and where you are. And one of the key things about financial budgeting is you've got to get the budget out, and you've got to actually get into the nitty gritty detail of how much do we spend on food? How much does that car actually cost to run? And so my kind of advice is really that you've just got to start and do it. And one by one, little things, starting off little, tend to over time become really big things. So I think establishing a little habit a small habit of change that you're determined to make a change in. Start small, even if it's a silly little thing about, right, we're going to take a walk every day for the next 30 days, and that'll impact on your physical fitness and probably your diet and your health and lots of little things. But the little things eventually becomes big things. So start small is my advice on habits.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.